I was raised by a criminal. Hey, my name's Cindy, and this is my story. My friends were sitting with me on the steps of the high school. There were sounds of people passing by, filling the air. They were so caught up in their lives that I simply listened in and watched with curiosity. My friends were talking amongst themselves, and I did my best to join in. "David is so hot," one said, smiling happily. "Nah, Jacob is so much hotter," another one said, and I simply nodded at both. In truth, I didn't really care much about those talks. They always talked like this, and it was often quite boring. But I paid attention as best as I could, and I went along with what was going on. Before long, however, I heard a familiar car drive by the high school, and I felt so relieved when I saw it pull up in front of me. A lot of people froze and looked at the car. I tried my best not to bring it up, letting the situation play out as I knew it would. A well-groomed man came out of the car, his suit well-pressed, his hair slick and combed perfectly. He was angular and handsome and looked quite young for someone who looked well off. His eyes scanned the crowds of the high school kids, everyone looking out with bated breath to see who it was he was looking for. "Who's that?" one of my friends said. "Some rich guy, and he's so hot. I wonder who he's here for," another friend asked, her gaze looking rather curious and eyeing the man intently. I simply sat up and headed out of the crowd without a word, leaving my friends confused as to why I started to leave. The crowd looked on as I stepped out to meet the guy's expression lightening to a soft smile as I approached. "Hey Cindy, let's get you home," the man said, kneeling down to my level and giving me a big hug. Everyone gasped in surprise, but I simply smiled and hugged him back. "Sure, Dad, let's head home," I replied, following him inside the car. "He's your dad, Cindy?" one of my friends asked, all of them rushing out of the crowd and looking at me with disbelief. They seemed confused as to why I had such a dad, but I simply nodded and said, "Well, see y'all tomorrow," before getting into the car as it revved up. Before long, we were on the highway, driving home with the traffic. Sights of the city passed by the window, my pockets casually resting in my hands. "How was school?" Dad asked. "Was all right, Dad. I made some new friends at high school," I replied, smiling happily as Dad continued to drive. We spoke about our days and bonded while we drove home. The new school was great. The teachers were really nice, and my friends were fun to be around, even if the topics were a little bit shallow. Dad spoke about his work, sounding really tired about all the extra work he's been forced to take. "I may not be home for long tonight, Cindy," he admitted, his face torn with sadness. I felt my heart sink a bit, but I pet his shoulder happily. "You owe me the usual then," I said teasingly, and Dad simply laughed and said, "You betcha." We got home not long after, an apartment near the mall that was quite spacious for the area. It wasn't a lot, but it was good for me, and we had enough space to do whatever we wanted, which I enjoyed a lot. Dad was cooking my favorite food, and I got into my home clothes and prepped the table. When Dad was done cooking mac and cheese and steak, we sat on the couch in the living area. I popped open our favorite game, and we ate dinner while we played together. Dad was competitive and always did his best to get into my hobbies whenever he was home. We played my favorite games together, reading books together, even bonded over a lot of things. Dad did his hardest for me, and I always thanked him for that. By the end, I started cleaning up as Dad looked from the couch with a little frustration. "Dang, you're good, Sin," he said, rubbing his sore thumbs from using the controller so much. "Course I am, Dad. I'm your daughter," I replied, chuckling to myself as I washed the dishes. He laughed and got up, heading to his room to prepare for work. "Hold down the fort, all right, Captain?" he teased, petting my head as he passed. "You got it, Sergeant," I joked back. It was a peaceful life, and I could tell right away why Dad was trying so hard for my sake. Ever since Mom died, he took everything on himself, and even though he worked so much and always came home so tired, when he saw me, he did his best to give me what I wanted and to spend time with me whenever he could. He listened a lot to the things that he probably didn't understand, but he tried still, and that meant something to me. I saw him head for the door, and I pouted. "Dad," I said with a raised voice, and he flinched and turned towards me. "Almost forgot." He gave me a big hug as I smiled into his arms. I was a daddy's girl, I admitted that, A high school kid, sure, but I loved Dad because he always did his best to raise me right. "Don't stay up too late, okay, Sin? I'll be home before you know it," he said as he headed for the door to leave. "I will, Dad. Do your best at work," I replied, a smile on my face as the door shut behind Dad. I got ready for bed, and soon I went to sleep, knowing that Dad would be okay and trusting that he'd come home safe. The next day, however, he never came home. I was confused. He always came home, always woke up and got food ready. I thought to myself, maybe he slept at work, so I simply nodded and waved the worry aside. Dad would be there to pick me up later. I'm sure of it. I prepped for school, ate some toast, and left on my own, doing my best not to worry. School went as normal, with people now asking me about my dad and simply glancing off their questions and focusing on classes. It was hard not to worry with everyone asking about him, but I persevered and I let things be. When it was time to go home, though, Dad never came. I was getting more anxious now. Dad always picked me up. Always. My friends saw my concern and asked, "Maybe he just got stuck in traffic," one said. Or people wanted his autograph because he looks like a celebrity, another one joked. They laughed, but I couldn't follow along. Eventually, everyone went home and Dad never arrived. I used the bus to get home, feeling my heart sink. Where was he? What was Dad doing? I was so confused as I got home that I didn't notice the police officer till I bumped into him. "I'm sorry, sir. Why are you here?" I asked, rubbing my forehead as I looked up at the man clad in blue police attire. "Are you Miss Cambia? Cindy Cambia?" he asked in a serious tone in his voice. I nodded and he pointed at me to sit down at our doorstep and he filled me in. So as I sat down, he eyed me up and down, as if sizing me up, and I felt the cold gaze of judgment hit me. After a few seconds, he spoke, reading from a clipboard. "Miss Cambia, your father was involved in a series of crimes across town. He'd stolen millions and caused quite a bit of trouble," he said. The news was so jarring, it almost made me fall over. "My dad, a criminal? No way, no way he is. What do you mean?" I replied, trying not to yell at the police officer. "It's as I said. He was involved in a series of crimes across town, including theft, arson, and many others," he said, showing me a file with my father's picture. I read it up and down, and I couldn't believe what it entailed. My dad? A criminal? No, he can't be. He was always so nice, always so caring. How could he do that? I tried my best not to break down, and I looked at the officer. "Where is he?" I said, balling up my fists. "We'll take you to see him. He wants to talk to you," the officer said, pointing to the nearby police car. I nodded and I followed him, trying to keep calm as the car drove away from home. Before long, I sat in front of Dad, his clothes torn and dirty, his face ragged and covered in bruises. He couldn't face me. His usual energy was gone. His hands were handcuffed to the table between us as I looked at him. I asked him why. I asked him why he could do all these things, why he did all those things. But he simply looked at me, concern in his gaze, and I knew instantly it was for me. It all made sense now. How he managed to give me everything I wanted, how he managed to raise me and meet all his parenting needs, how he managed to be there every night despite still handling rent and bills. He did this for me. I couldn't look at him. I couldn't. Pain welling in my heart. But when he spoke, it all melted away like water into a dark sea. "I did it because I wanted to provide for you, Sin. I knew handling more jobs wouldn't cut it. I know I was wrong. I knew it was wrong, but I did my best to take care of you after your mom died. I'm sorry, Cindy." His words melted away and faded out because anger was going through my head. And before long, I was hugging him. He hugged me. The guards broke us apart. The guards said that he was dangerous and we shouldn't be hugging each other or he might escape. But I shook my head and I looked at my dad. "I'll always be here for you, okay, Dad? I know you did your best. And when things get rough, I'll be waiting." He nodded, a smile forming on his face as I forgave him. I visited Dad as frequently as I could while he was in jail, keeping the house going on the savings he gave me, as well as the help of my extended family. They were mad at first, but forgave him in time, and I thanked them for supporting him after all the hardships he went through. I knew Dad did his best for me. He fell down the wrong path, but he did it to provide for me, so I showed him I loved him no matter what he did. "Do your best in there and come home safe, Sergeant," I said in a mock salute. He smiled and nodded. "Yes, ma'am, Captain," he replied, returning my salute with his own.